Hello, I'm Jennifer
Hi.
Gaskinson here from Buildxact, Vice President of Ambassador and Industry Partner Programs, and I'm here with Megan Shapiro. Megan, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, good morning, Jennifer. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you.
Yes, we are too. So tell me a little bit about your background. Who are you? What are you doing? And I know you've got a lot of roles, you wear a lot of hats, and it's very cool to see somebody who's such a leader. And actually, let's actually before that, how did you get into construction, and why are you here today?
So if it's okay with you, both of those answers kind of naturally go together. I am a full-time construction attorney, licensed and practicing in California. My sort of side passion is proactive risk management for construction leaders. I got into construction sort of by accident. I like to say that I fell into construction law and then fell in love with construction law. So, not to tell too long of a story, but essentially, when I started at the firm that I currently work at back in like 2012, there was a much smaller construction practice at the time, and the attorneys in the firm didn't really view it with much high esteem. It was not a well-respected practice area, and so they would sort of use it as the training ground for new and young attorneys. So when I started, they were like, "Hey, new girl, here you go." And I'd had a tiny little sliver of experience with doing like one construction defect litigation at a prior job. And I got really lucky because at the time the firm was representing primarily one major subcontractor. And that contractor just so happened to have hired a new GM right around the same time that I came in. And so he came in and started looking at their P&L and was like, you know what, we're spending a lot on attorneys. I think I personally want to dig into this and see what's going on. And so he and I kind of came in at the same time and we were like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing either. Okay, well, let's just figure it out together and make this what we want it to be. And they were a concrete subcontractor. I uncovered a previously unknown passion for concrete. I actually love, I say frequently, concrete has my heart. And so we kind of built up the practice into what we wanted it to be. And I went to the partners at the time and I said, hey, you know what? I want to take ownership of this. I love it. It doesn't need to be like the redheaded stepchild that gets passed down to new attorneys anymore. I'm going to take ownership of it. I love it. And so I built up the practice, and now almost 15 years later, I still represent that concrete subcontractor. And now I've grown the practice to be about 95% for me construction. I represent my caseload's about 95% construction.
I said no one ever. Concrete has my heart.
I,
I love that. That's just that you kind of just made my day. So
yeah.
that's
Like literally, I finally got to go to World of Concrete for the first time in like I think it was 2017, and it was like it's still in my top 5 best life experiences. It's like I can't wait to get back again. I bought like all the swag. I got like the sweatshirt and the t-shirt and the coffee mug and the water bottle. Like I'm a concrete nerd.
that's fabulous. So that's a really cool introduction, and I just want to talk to our audience for a second. Again, I'm Jennifer with Buildxact, and we're here with Megan Shapiro. And we do have the chat open, so please let us know when or how or if you have questions. I don't want to be asking all the questions, so you can send us whatever your thoughts are. So tell us a little bit more about, and you're an instructor, so this will come across very smoothly, I'm sure. But what is risk management, and what does it mean for a custom home builder or a remodeler?
Boy, no pressure. You're really setting the bar high there on me, Jennifer.
I
Geez.
am, yes.
I know. So I think of risk management, my approach to it anyway. And let me back up just quickly. A lot of times when construction leaders and people in the industry hear construction or hear risk, they automatically go straight to like insurance. Oftentimes when you hear about risk professionals, risk management professionals within the construction industry, it usually is people that are more on the insurance side, the brokers, the captives, the people that are kind of coming at it from, let's show these construction companies how they can reduce their insurance claims. And that's what they mean when they say manage risk. So I like to sort of establish out of the gate that that's not me. That's not the perspective that I'm coming from. So my definition is probably going to be a little bit different than what people may be used to hearing if their primary source of information on risk management is coming from their carriers and their brokers. So my approach to risk management is really informed by the lessons that I've learned in litigating construction disputes over 15 years. After doing it for this long, it was really kind of became clear to me that there were a lot of things that were happening over and over and over again by the time we got into a dispute that had escalated to litigation. And I realized there are a lot of things that we could be doing proactively on the front end to mitigate that risk and minimize the likelihood that these issues are going to pop up at all. If they do, that they're going to escalate. And if they do escalate, that we could be doing things on the front end to put, the contractors in the best possible position to prevail if the worst does actually happen. So my perspective on risk is much more holistic. I don't like necessarily using that word because I know people get fuzzy about the word holistic, but it's kind of a 360 all-encompassing approach. I look at risk in a lot of different facets and areas of the business, including things like strategic corporate formation strategies to mitigate and minimize risk. And by an example of that, what I mean is, let's say you've got a company that's really growing and they have a fleet, for example. It might be wise for them, in order to silo off areas of risk, to create a holding company, a master holding company, and then smaller subsidiary companies to sort of allocate that risk. So one of them would be the holder of the fleet. And so now that one company, if there's a catastrophic car accident, for example, with a driver who's on the job and there's a death, for example, that's a potential huge liability risk, but it would be limited to just the company that's holding the fleet. And it wouldn't transfer over to, let's say, the actual quote unquote construction company that's doing the work and bringing in the income. So there are sort of strategic things that you can do to sort of manage and mitigate and silo off risk from a corporate formation standpoint. Certainly contracts, everybody thinks about that. That's a huge way that you can sort of proactively manage risk on the front end and mid project. I'm a huge proponent of robust documentation policies. That usually comes into play when you start to get into areas of disputes. And then training and continuous improvement is really, really a big one as well. So when I'm talking about risk management, I really am coming at it from this perspective of looking at the company as a whole, and how can we put this company in the best possible position to manage that risk for the longevity of the company and to increase profits as a result of being proactive and strategic about those risk decisions.
That's fascinating. And there's so much. I was listening to How I Built This by the Guy Raz podcast yesterday. And the owner of Thermagun, like that
the massage gun thing. Yeah.
So he was saying that one of his friends advised him, because he was going through a divorce, advised him to sign everything over to him so that his wife didn't come after him to get, like half of everything he owned.
Uh-huh.
Well, the friend ran off with everything. Isn't that devastating? Like, I just can't even imagine that happening. But
wow.
My point to that is that you don't even know where risk hides.
That, you know what? I'm so glad you said that, because one of the first things that I talk about when I'm first having an initial risk conversation with a potential client or a client is there are so many blind spots. You don't know what you don't know. And so a huge part of what I talk about and what I teach is methods and procedures to uncover those blind spots, because you have to, it's really step 2, but you kind of have to start there, because if you don't know what you don't know, you can do all the things right to manage and mitigate the risk that you're aware of. And that sneaky sleeper risk that you never even thought about can be the thing that takes it all away.
Yeah. It's crazy. And hopefully that doesn't happen to anybody. And hopefully everybody who's listening is smarter and they are able to protect themselves better. So speaking of that, like, are there fundamental ways or like a basic formula to assess the risk that you're under?
Yeah, there are several, actually. I'm a huge proponent of looping in your team members, particularly the people who are actually, I call them sort of field guys, but particularly the people that are actually like on the boots on the ground doing the work, and having the conversation with them. For my clients, I actually created a survey that they can use with their team that asks the questions to kind of get the dialogue going. And it's a confidential survey so that people can feel free to be candid, because that's really, as leaders, what we need. Because the team around you, they're the ones that are actually living in the day-to-day. Oftentimes leaders are stuck working on the business as opposed to in the business, which is what they should be doing as leaders. But that contributes to some of those blind spots that they have from that sort of like C-suite level, right? They're focused on different areas and different things. And having that conversation, that dialogue, asking those questions to your project managers, your superintendents, your foremen, and saying to them, what are you seeing out there? What do you think are the biggest risks of that we are facing? Because they're going to have a totally different answer than the guy that's looking at the P&L statement all day or the guy that's looking at insurance renewals, right? So their perspective is different. Their considerations are different. And so there's a lot of unique perspectives that they can bring that can kind of shine a spotlight on some of these areas of risk that as leaders, we are somewhat blind to, but that our teams are so intimately familiar with because they're living with it every day.
Yeah, so fascinating. And if we are talking to, a custom home builder or a remodeler, how can we tell them, like, where is the fundamental place to start? Where can they say, I can take out, I'm going to go back, like just a parallel, there were some people in times of COVID who were wearing gloves and masks and, like the specific mask, when I was just throwing on the cloth mask that I made at home. So I was able to take on a little bit more risk, but somebody, who was just the minimal amount and can just protect themselves with, these maybe 3 basic things.
Yeah. So first of all, I always love suggesting that people start with a risk tolerance assessment because I think we intuitively have an idea for ourselves as individuals, what we can tolerate. With your COVID example, that's a prime example, right? Like, you know yourself, what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not. And sometimes as we grow into a leadership role, our risk tolerance for business is different than our risk tolerance individually. And so I think that it's valuable and worthwhile to sort of pause and take the time to kind of do a check-in and say, like, okay, what really is my risk tolerance for this business? Because that's going to inform all the other decisions that we make. And so some of the sort of like base level things that they can be doing, insurance is a huge part of it, right? I mean, if you think of risk as risk management as a puzzle, insurance is a huge piece of that puzzle, potentially several pieces of that puzzle. And I like to kind of draw the distinction of insurance being a little bit reactive, right? Because insurance only comes in once a problem has happened, but it's still a super important part of an overall risk strategy. And so leveraging those policies, having a good relationship with your broker so you can you have somebody that really understands the fundamentals of your business and what you actually need. Because when it comes to this particular type of business, some of them are going to want to consider things like professional liability insurance on top of their general liability insurance. If they're doing any design part of it, that's going to be a policy that other contractors might not ever want to, they may not ever need to consider it. But for, if you're actually doing any part of the design element, if you're holding any of the risk for the design side, you might want to consider talking to your broker about getting a professional liability policy on top of your general liability policy. Sure. Or another example for this particular business model is oftentimes building envelope and water issues are always a concern because it's like water can be so devastating, right? And so many GL policies have mold exclusions, and you need a specific pollution policy to be able to cover claims related to mold and water intrusion. And so that might be a policy that you might want to consider exploring based on your particular business model. So insurance is a huge one. Another one that I kind of referenced a little bit at the beginning of the conversation, but on a more basic level, is making sure that you are protecting yourself with a corporate formation that makes sense for you. Oftentimes with this particular type of business, I see many more businesses trying to operate as sole proprietors, and they're not taking that step of actually forming an LLC and making it into an S Corp or a C Corp, whatever makes sense for the business model. And they're not necessarily aware of how much risk they're taking on by operating as a sole proprietor. And they think, well, we're not really doing a ton of the work ourselves. We're remodelers. We're hiring that out. We've got trades. We've got subs. We've got, right. And so they think like they're not really holding a lot of risk, but they are. And the risk that sole proprietors are holding far exceeds any other risk concern that I could ever even start talking about, because now you're talking about your individual personal assets, your partner's personal assets, your spouse's personal assets. So making sure that you're talking to, a knowledgeable CPA who actually understands your business as well, to make sure that they're giving you guidance, or an attorney, a business formations attorney, to give you guidance on making sure that you're protected from a liability standpoint with regard to the corporate formation, certainly insurance, and then having some training policies. These are sort of the top three things that anybody can do in any business, but certainly for, remodelers and custom home builders. Having a robust training process in place, again, for your sort of superintendent level, your project management level, and even your foreman level, so that everybody is operating from the same page, the same playbook, to make sure that everything is being done the way that the company has decided it needs to be done to sort of manage, mitigate, and insulate from that risk.
I love that. Those are great tips. Are small business owners, or are they more at risk? And I'm just curious about that. I'm thinking about our customers who are small business owners, and they're also, maybe their skill set is a little bit outside, doing contracts and owning a business or operating a business, where they're more, they came in from just building or construction.
Yeah.
So are they more at risk for any reason?
Yeah, so I hesitate to give a blanket answer, right? Because this is my lawyer hat. It depends. It always depends, right? There's always a bunch of variable factors. But I would say that based on my experience and my observation, the reason why the sort of small business owners that are like, I had a couple of posts on LinkedIn very recently where I sort of was using this hypothetical example of Jake the Mason. Jake was a great mason. He worked in the field. He was great at his job. He started taking side work, started bringing his buddies in because he was getting so much side work. And eventually he was like, you know what? I'm going to leave my job and start my own masonry company because I'm a great mason. Jake doesn't know anything about running a business, right? That's exactly what you're getting at. And so I think oftentimes the only reason that small business owners might be at more risk than larger business owners is simply because I think it comes down to two reasons. One, they're more likely to not know what they don't know, because the experience that they're drawing upon is usually limited to doing the actual work and not around business formations, business entities, running a business. They don't necessarily have those same support systems. They maybe don't have other business owners in their network and friend group that they can sort of bounce ideas off of. They're probably not involved in peer groups that like bigger businesses might be. So that's one reason. And then the other reason is that they're bootstrapping it a lot of the time, right? And so they might not necessarily have, even if they are aware of the blind spots, they might not have the resources available to do all of the things necessary to really have a robust proactive risk management system in place. That is why a lot of times I see these guys operating as sole proprietors, because they'd have a misunderstanding or a misconception about how expensive it is to make an LLC. And so they're just like, well, I don't have the time to learn about it and dig into it. I don't have the resources to pay for it or outsource the learning in that decision making. And it's always been fine, so it'll continue to be fine. And I'm just going to keep my head in the sand. So I do think that small business owners can be a little bit more prone to risk, but I think, again, it's for those reasons. I don't think there's anything inherent in small businesses versus large businesses that is necessarily inherently more risky. I think it just comes down to those factors with the owners and the people who are starting those businesses.
Sure. And actually, so right into what has been on my mind, and I don't know if you can do this, but can you quantify that? Meaning, so like, is there a certain amount that you should invest in protecting yourself based off of your annual revenue, or like, how should they be thinking about it in terms of, or like, what is the potential for loss at whatever level of revenue? So like, how can you quantify the risk for our audience?
That is tough. And I think it's because measuring risk and conversely measuring the ROI on risk management strategies is kind of an amorphous thing to do, because by definition, if you're doing a good job at risk management, then you're trying to measure the thing that never happened, right? You're trying to measure the lawsuit that you never got. You're trying to measure the settlement you never had to pay. And so it can be a little bit challenging to sort of quantify in that way. So instead, I try to flip it and look at it as sort of almost more like a tiered system. Like, okay, these are the base level things that you have to do it. You just have to figure it out. You got to find, like in California, for example, it's $800 a year to have an LLC. It's nothing. You can manage that. And you don't even need an attorney to form it for you in California. You can do it yourself. And like our Secretary of State website is actually pretty robust in terms of how-tos and guides to walk you through it. So you literally can do it on your own, but you can also find services online. We've all seen these, like Legal Zooms or whatever, that'll do it for you for still a relatively small amount of money. There's no excuse for anybody to be operating as a sole proprietor and bearing all of that risk. So same thing with insurance. There's a certain amount of insurance that you just have to have, especially when you start getting into bigger contracts. You're going to be contractually required to be carrying a minimum amount of insurance anyway, right? Especially CGL policy, maybe not that professional liability policy that we talked about, but maybe that becomes your tier 2. So I kind of try to quantify it in terms of tiers as you grow in the business. So at a bare minimum, starting out, minimum outlay of capital, you've got to do a few certain things to just start your business out of the gate, form an LLC, get the insurance that you have to have. Then once you've grown a little bit and you've got a little bit more bandwidth and a little bit more resources available, then you can start stepping up the tiers as to what types of proactive risk management strategies you're willing to invest in. And that's when you start getting a little bit more strategic. Like, okay, we're growing. Do we need to get a fleet? If we get a fleet, do we need to rethink our corporate formation strategy? Do we need to be looking at having a holding company? Okay, we are doing a little bit more design work. Maybe we should start looking at additional insurance policies that we don't necessarily have to have, but probably it would be a smart business decision to have those. And so I kind of look at it that way because I don't have a good answer for you. I wish I did. If anybody in the audience has one, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So here's a hypothetical, but maybe really based in reality. So yesterday, Iowa was hit by some tornadoes. And what if you had a job site? What if you had a home that was like 40% complete and it was wiped out by a tornado? How do you prevent something like that? Or like, how do you think about protecting yourself from something like that?
So that's going to be primarily a contract question and secondarily an insurance question. Mm-hmm. Contracts are a huge part of risk management and making sure that you have a legally solid, robust contract that is, I hesitate to use the word shifting the risk because I like to approach risk management from a standpoint of trying to figure out what's as fair as possible to everybody. If you really mean it when you call your subs trade partners and you want to invest in these relationships and have longstanding relationships with the people who you're working with, then you don't want to be shifting all of the risk to them. You're also more likely to get them to just say, you know what, I'm not willing to work with you. But there are provisions in the contract that are specifically designed to manage the allocation of that risk. A tornado would fall under what we call a force majeure clause that you may have heard because nobody talked about force. They've been in construction contracts for forever. Nobody knew what they meant. Nobody talked about them until COVID. And then COVID happened and there were these mass shutdowns of construction, at least initially, at least in California. Even construction had like the immediate stop work. Everybody's got to stay at home until construction was deemed essential. And so there was like that period of time where everybody was panicking. Like, okay, these projects are losing money. Who's bearing this? Who's bearing these losses? What do we do with this? And all of a sudden, force majeure clauses became like the popular new girl at school that everybody was like, okay, what is this? Most force majeure clauses are going to cover weather incidents. And so depending on how the language in that clause is worded and how it allocates the risk that goes along with force majeure events, including a tornado, that's how you can manage that risk. So as a custom home builder or a remodeler, where if the home's only 40% complete, it's still yours contractually, right? You're still responsible for it. You haven't turned it over to anybody. You would want to have, not legal advice, you would want to probably talk to your construction attorney and probably have a force majeure clause in your contracts that specifies exactly what happens in the case of a force majeure event. Take out force majeure, take out the tornado, but the concepts apply equally across the board on these sort of key contractual provisions, right? Indemnity, defense, all of these key contractual provisions that are designed to allocate and shift risk. You have to just be like, I would consider your contract to be that sort of like first tier. You're starting a construction business. This is just one of the things you got to do right out of the gate. And that's get a legally compliant for your state, robust construction contract. It's especially important for remodelers, for example, because at least in California, remodelers are subject to some different and specific contractual requirements by our licensing board, by our contractor state licensing board. So they have to have a contract that has specific stuff in it that's outlined by the contractor's licensing board, or if they don't, the results are pretty catastrophic. They could lose their license, but also they could be subject to disgorgement and treble damages, which means, if you don't know what the term disgorgement means, anybody that's watching, disgorgement means you have to return all the money that you were paid for the work you did. You got to give it all back, even though you did the work. And the homeowner gets to keep the house. You got to give the money back that they paid you because you didn't have a legally compliant contract. In some cases, again, it all depends. If there is nuance, but that's my point. There's nuance, and that's why that's one of those things that to me is one of those tier 1 concerns. You're starting a construction business. These are just one of the minimum things you just got to do right out of the gate.
This is so fascinating. It's like this is a world that I'm not heavily invested in. It's also seems so dangerous. I don't know. It seems so. How do you take that maybe intimidation factor away? And like I think contracts is a big part of it. And where and how should small business owners be looking at what contracts, and maybe just from a high level? I know we're kind of running out of time, so if, we could talk about that real quick.
Yeah. So I always hate that because every time I go on somebody else's live stream, everybody is universally like, okay, now I'm terrified. And I'm like, well, great. I've done my job for the day, I guess. That's what I do. I'm just a Grim Reaper of terror. And so that's absolutely not my point. My point is there are so many things that you can be doing so that it doesn't have to be scary. Yeah. You just have to know, right? You just have to know what you need to do. From a contract standpoint, to answer that specific question, because I am mindful of time, it depends on where you are, but oftentimes your state's state licensing board's website will be a really great starting point. They will sometimes have full template contracts that are legally compliant. They will sometimes have resources that they'll direct you to for places where you can find help making sure you have a legally compliant contract. If you do go the route of talking to an attorney to make sure that you're getting a legally compliant contract, I'm always in favor of that. But I always say that with a little bit of a caution, because construction law, despite what some attorneys will try to tell you, is very specific. A general business attorney is not going to necessarily be able to give you the best advice on your construction contract. They might be able to help you with those sort of strategic corporate formation questions that we talked about a while ago. But when you're talking about making sure you've got a legally compliant construction contract, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you vet the attorney that you're talking to and figure out exactly what their specific experience is with construction contracts and litigation in your state. And the reason why I throw in litigation is because I became much better at drafting and revising construction contracts after I had been litigating the disputes for a while, because I saw what happens when it's done poorly. And so it was sort of like, oh man, I know what a bad one looks like and how bad it can be. I know now how to write it better. Yeah. So we want to be vetting these attorneys well and make sure, ask the questions. What is your experience with construction law? How many construction contracts have you written? How many have you revised? How many have you negotiated? How often have you been involved in construction litigation? How many construction clients do you represent? What kinds of clients are they? Are they subs? Are they design professionals? Because that's a totally different ballgame too. Those laws are completely different as well. So you just want to be asking those types of questions. And not to give too much of a plug, I have a lot of free available resources to at least get the ball rolling on some of these things. I've got checklists where you can start by sort of like, the checklists really help with that sort of uncovering the blind spots you don't know about. I got a lot of free resources on my website, meganshapiro.com. There's a whole, the tab is free resources. It couldn't be easier to find. Lots of free resources there. I'm available on LinkedIn. Feel free to shoot me a DM. I do have my online proactive risk management course that is specifically designed to go over all of these areas of risk for construction leaders, whether they're Jake the Mason who's starting his business and needs to know how to do it from the ground up, or it's the guy that's been in business for a while, it's been working, but he can't quite figure out how to scale because he can't manage that risk effectively. So there are resources out there that are available that won't break the bank. You don't have to go hire somebody like me, a construction litigator on retainer at $10,000 a month, because somebody's selling you a bill of sale that like you need me to make sure you're not going to get into trouble. That's not the case. There are a lot of resources available out there. I'm happy to point people in the right direction. I have a wide connection of networks. I know construction attorneys who are trusted and reliable in other states. So please feel free to reach out to me if you're looking for somebody to work with.
I love it. And thank you so much for your valuable time, Megan, and your expertise and your insights. This has been it's been so good. So really, really appreciate it. Yeah. Really appreciate everybody who joined us today. And like she said, reach out to her via LinkedIn. Look up Megan Shapiro, construction attorney, risk strategist, and instructor. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was a ton of fun. We should do it again sometime.
Yes,
Maybe you can come on my live stream.
All right, let's do it. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.